The countdown. There we go. I think I'm going to go ahead and start, Bernice. We might not have the countdown video, so I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone and give a short little preview here. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the International African American Museum Center for Family History monthly podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Shelley Viola Murphy, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today for what promises to be an engaging and an insightful discussion. For some of you know that over the Black History Month here in February, we have highlighted discussions specifically about free people of color. The podcast is live streaming right now on StreamYard and YouTube, and also at the museum in Charleston, South Carolina. We're proud to bring you this monthly podcast series held on the third Saturday of each month, except for the month of February. We explore topics and bring African American history, genealogy, and culture to life. These conversations are part of our ongoing commitment, connecting communities and their rich and diverse heritage. I'm joined by Whitney Day, who is in the background. She is our lead research associate at the Center for Family History at the museum in Charleston. As we move through today's discussion, we encourage our attendees to participate actively. So if you have questions for our host that's here, our guest host, please put a Q in front of your question. And we will be able to entertain the questions after the end of our discussion. So we're going to open the floor up again at the end, put the Q in the chat box. So now let's welcome our distinguished guest, Bernice Alexander Bennett. Welcome, Bernice. Please take a moment to introduce yourself, share any titles you hold, and just tell us a little bit about the roles that you play in the genealogy arena. And I want to also say to anyone that's tuning in, let us know where you're tuning in from. And I also see a few of our genealogy buddies that are tuning in. But we'd like to know where some people are hailing in and watching this. So Bernice, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shelley Viola Murphy. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bernice Alexander Bennett. I'm a genealogist, family historian, author, podcaster, genie buddy, and my research is in Louisiana and also South Carolina. And I hope I said author because I do have 3 award-winning books of which I'm very proud of.
Awesome. Well, as folks know, we're going to do like some round robin type thing with some questions. And this is 2 genealogists, and we've known each other well over 15 years. I don't even know how long it has been, but we've worked on things together. And I will say one thing and give a shameless plug for Maggie. If you would like to say something about Maggie, the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute, because not only are you an author and a professional genealogist, you are also coordinator and instructor through Maggie. And then there's also one other thing which I will ask you about after you say something about your role at Maggie.
Yes, well, at Maggie, as you mentioned, I have served as the coordinator for DNA. I've stepped down from doing that. However, I still teach in track 1B.
Yes.
And this is the track of which we look at slave ship narratives. We also look at, I say slave ship narratives, but actually it's runaway slave narratives,
Yeah.
slave ship manifests,
Mhm.
and there are other resources that I discuss in some of the sessions that I have taught. And it has been an absolute pleasure to be a part of the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute. We started this over 10 years ago.
This is good. We're going into year 13,
Going in year
2025.
going into
Yes.
year 13, and have had the opportunity to meet wonderful people, just amazing people that have gone on to do even more amazing work.
Wow.
And so teaching is something that I have enjoyed doing. I am a former teacher once upon a time, and also worked in the area of public health. And so genealogy right now is who I am and what I will be until the day my eyes close and I join the ancestors.
And you, same thing for me. So I do want to bring up one other thing that you didn't note. There's something called Blog Talk Radio research, right, at the National Archives and beyond, and a new adventure. So if you'll comment on that and let folks know that little piece of you right there.
Right. Well, for 10 years, I had a podcast on Blog Talk Radio. 10 whole years, which means I had opportunity to talk to people, to historians, authors, genealogists, storytellers. 10 years, folks, over 400 episodes. Well, Blog Talk Radio has shut down their platform, folks, but I have moved into a new arena. And the new platform is with Spreaker.com. And my new show is called Ancestors Footprints. This is a show of which everyone has an opportunity to come on and share stories, research, even just things that they want to know about and talk about. But this is the opportunity that I am now engaged in. And I welcome those of you that want to come on my show. That's all you have to do is drop me a message.
All right. All right. Thank you for that. So now I'm going to start our great discussion here. So again, of course, the overarching theme is free people of color. So Bernice, why do you think it's essential to include free people of color in our genealogical research? And how does that history reshape, I'm going to say, the traditional narratives that are out there of American history?
Well, I want to just start off by saying, including free people of color in genealogy provides a fuller picture of American history. Challenging the misconceptions that all African Americans were enslaved before the Civil War. I mean, their stories highlight resilience, economic contributions, and legal battles for rights. So recognizing their roles reshapes narratives to be more inclusive of diverse Black experiences.
And I think that's something that a lot of folks are missing out. And there's a lot of myths that are out there also concerning free people of color. So share what you've faced throughout or have recognized some of these common misconceptions, and how does genealogy research help to correct that narrative there?
Yes, well, some misconceptions include the belief that free people of color were rare, that they lived only in the North.
Oh, goodness, I've heard that one.
Or that they had no social or economic mobility. Now, genealogy research, when you talk about, well, what does genealogy do? It corrects these myths by uncovering records that show that free people of color communities that were thriving, both in the North and the South. They were engaged in businesses, education, and land ownership. So it's something that we need to take into consideration when you start hearing where there were no free people of color or they were only in the North. We have to look broader than just the North. Look at the South. I mean, you had Yael, your first guest, and she was talking about free people of color in Louisiana, not to mention free people of color in South Carolina and Charleston. So we have to look broader to determine just, how valid is that myth.
Well, and let me say this a little bit. Growing up, we really didn't hear about free people of color. I'm saying it that way. And the myth that I grew up with, and I grew up in the North, but all Black people were slaves. I didn't learn until later that there was a difference. I thought that's just where all of us came from, was from slaves, which you just clarified, that is a misconception. Free people of color are everywhere, but also, just like you said, slavery was not just in the South. Very prevalent within the North and the Northeast.
Right.
So thank you for clarifying that. Because like I said, I grew up in Michigan. Slaves, that's how I got started in genealogy. Because my mama said her grandmother told her that her daddy was a slave. And I was like, what? What does that mean? That's how I started asking questions and looking at it. So I think those myths and misconceptions also will take us, the researchers, and those in the audience up to that brick wall, as they want to call it, to a brick wall where it stampers, or halts our genealogy because we're believing of what we've been told over time. So,
also, Shelley, when you say we're believing what we've been told over time, we have to understand we're talking about 10%. I mean, we're not talking about 50% of Black people were free. We're really not. However, it does not mean that we don't study free people of color.
Absolutely.
It's part of American history, and it's part of a narrative that we should incorporate when we're talking about who's in American history. We're in American history. Black people, they were free and, yes, enslaved.
And that could go for all people of color, Native Americans, Asians, and so forth. So excluding free people of color from the mainstream genealogy, does that limit our understanding of the African American history and the broader impact on the nation?
Well, I want to just say, exclusion creates incomplete.
Good one.
Think of that. Exclusion creates incomplete and often misleading history, ignoring the legal, political, and social struggles that free people of color face. Of course, enslaved people, they certainly experience a lot of problems, but we also have to recognize that free people of color also experience issues politically, legally, the social struggles. We need to talk about that. Their contributions to the abolitionist movements, property ownership, early civil rights efforts are often left out, which means it's distorting the historical record of the role that free people of color played in this American community.
Well,
American history.
And everything that you just named is a source. Every bit of what you just named. So again, I know I'll be watching the recording back because I need to write those down, because every one of the things could lead to more information or even a record.
Yes.
So again, thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to another question. What are some of the biggest challenges researchers face when they're actually tracing free people of color ancestors, and how do you think they could overcome those challenges?
Well, I want to go back to, I said exclusion creates incomplete.
Incomplete.
Challenges include
Yeah.
incomplete records, the names change, racial reclassification over time. They may start off as Black, but over time, they're reclassified differently. Lost documentation. It's just missing. And so
Or never
overcoming them,
created.
yes, yes. So overcoming them requires using diverse sources such as tax records, manumission records, court documents, records in the community, and that includes newspapers,
Oh,
that
yeah.
includes these societies and clubs that free people of color participated in, even the religious groups. I mean, we need to think very broadly about where do you find information on free people of color beyond the census.
And that comes right to the movement of researching communities, not just looking at your ancestor, but also look at the whole community who is around your people, or call it the fan club by Elizabeth Joan Mill, friends, associates, and neighbors. So absolutely, you got to, again, look broader, look at the community. Where is everybody? And I will say this, when I go in, say, for a new community, a new line I'm looking at or whatever, first thing I look at, where's the courthouse? Where's the churches? Where's the public libraries? And where is the cemeteries? That is my first introduction. And then tried to find out about the county. Did it break off from somewhere else? When did it start? So now I'm gathering to know where to target. And again, I have to now look at that if I'm looking for free people of color. Because typically in my research, I'm looking for the formerly enslaved people. So I have to turn it back a little bit. So are there specific records that are free people a record, or called, a free people a record document? Because a lot of times we get that question asked, from people we're interacting in. And where would we look for specific records that might be called a free people a record? Where would we find that kind of source at?
Well, one source, and this would perhaps focus on those people that were formerly enslaved, but they were manumitted.
Ah, yes.
So we want to look for manumission papers.
Got it.
Also, you may find, and while the Civil War is over, you definitely have the Freedmen Bureau records. And in those records, people will identify who they are.
Yes.
Some will say they were formerly enslaved. Some were free people of color all the while. But you want to look at the Freedmen records. And of course, I mentioned census records, especially pre-1870.
Which we can dispel that myth right now, because you mentioned the collection of the Freedmen Bureau, which is 1865 to 1872, 3.4 million records. So the myth of getting to 1870 could be a challenge, but there are records prior to 1870 where you're going to find free people of color as well as enslaved people. So thank you for bringing that up.
Right.
So
I also want to mention some more records.
Sure.
Okay. Tax rolls.
Oh, yes.
You want to look at tax rolls. You want to look at wills, even apprenticeship. We were talking about apprenticeship records, and then local courthouses. Yeah. Go into those local court, look at local court cases, and you can see stories. They'll have vital information that will help individuals when they're researching free people of color.
So how many genealogists or family historians, whoever it is, overlook free people of color in the historical research? And what can be done to ensure that inclusion moving forward? Because we're skipping over. A lot of us are targeting those enslaved, but the free people of color are standing right there, and they're probably relatives of the people that are enslaved.
Well, the reality is, when you overlook free people of color and you start thinking everybody was enslaved, you have to then say, wait a minute, this is an oversight, because everyone was not enslaved. We have to look at ensuring that we have education that will provide people with information to let them know that this is a myth and that free people of color did exist. You need to highlight the free people of color in records and genealogy workshops. We need to just tell the stories. I'm really into storytelling. And the more stories that can be told, the more education and the more insight people will get. Now, you have to understand that it's hard when you start looking at free people of color. They were kind of in a precarious situation. And when I say that, I think of the Solomon Northup story. He's a free person of color, but what happened to him? He was enslaved.
And it was in the North.
Kidnapped.
But remember, he was in the North and got
taken to the South.
Yes.
And so I would think free people of color were kind of walking on a tightrope, not knowing whether they were going to be captured, not knowing how they were marginalized. But we also need to study them and to understand and look at, advocate for their presence in mainstream genealogy databases and discussions, just as you have done the last 3 weeks of talking about free people of color. We need to have that conversation going on and on.
So are we really telling people, based on what we've said here, that free people of color did not have it any better than folks that were enslaved? Because, for Virginia, they taught in the public school about the happy slave and the good master. We're combating that with these stories. But it seems that the type of records you listed, and I do see that Viola Baskerville also noted that she found free people of color in a plantation account books. They were also listed. But did free people of color, and again, you talked about the fears that they had and experiences, but did they have it better because they were free versus someone that was enslaved?
I want to say yes, they did. They had it better, but they still had to watch their back.
Yes.
I mean, you just look at it. They were free today, but could be enslaved tomorrow. So we have to think about, well, what was going on? No matter what, color was the color.
Yeah.
And they were marginalized. But we also understand that free people of color were also active participants in shaping the country before, during, and after the war.
That's true.
And so we have to, take that into consideration. We have to think about those patriots. We have to think about those people who were in the War of 1812. We have to think about those Civil War soldiers.
Yeah.
And some fought for the Union. Others petitioned for rights. And many worked as landowners and were entrepreneurs. And so they complicated the usual enslaved versus abolitionist narrative. And we need to understand and study the narrative of what role did free people of color play in the communities.
And I, as a mother, try to put myself in the situation back there saying I'm free and I have babies. that threat and that experience, and they lived with that every day.
Mhm.
And it didn't matter that they were free or not. It was more about just what they looked like and who they were.
Mhm.
So yes, they could walk down the street and not locked in on a plantation, but as you said, they could be grabbed at any time, and but think of or I think of the fear of
Yes.
having to worry being a free person, but at any time that could be gone.
Right.
And it could be just a family member, or it could be me, just snatched away. Where the enslaved people, they're dealing with the same thing
Yes.
during the same time and even after. So, there's even situations today in 2025 that is carryover from, I'm going to say 1850, 1840, or whatever it is. So it just gives a different look because most people think they had it better. And like you said, in some cases they might have, but in other cases, the whole fear and the experience of their everyday life brings on something else.
Right.
The whole,
Absolutely.
and I'm going to throw it this way, and which will trigger for you to say something, the whole emotional side of
Yes.
living, being a person of color, and
Yes.
the experiences that they might have.
Mhm. Mhm.
So researching free people of color challenged traditional Civil War and Reconstruction era narratives. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Let me will you say that question again?
How does research on free people of color challenge the traditional Civil War and Reconstruction narratives? And I'm going to say this publicly. I struggle with what they call Reconstruction because it was not successful. And I'm still looking for the Reconstruction
Mhm.
that happened. Yes, there were a few wins, but again, how do we help educate and get folks to understand what's going on?
But I want to go back to, I think earlier you did ask this question about how does the research challenge traditional Civil War
Yes,
and Reconstruction era
yes.
narratives? And I think what you realize is that free people of color were active participants.
Yes. Yes.
They were not so silent that they were invisible.
Yes.
And so they had something to do with shaping the country before, during, and after the war. As I said earlier, some fought in the wars, and we have to acknowledge that. Others petitioned for rights.
This is where we got to tell
And
those stories.
yes, we have to tell those
Yeah.
stories. And many worked as landowners, owners, and entrepreneurs. They complicate. They were there.
Yeah.
They were there with a voice.
Yeah.
They were there watching and paying attention.
So you mentioned voice. So a record you shared, and we'll have Whitney bring it up. Talk to me about this important piece of information you shared with me.
Right. I shared with you this book, and it was written by Mark Charles Rudenay, and it spoke of the America's first Black daily newspaper in New Orleans. And it was founded July 21st, 1864, the New Orleans Tribune.
Oh, that's during the war then.
The New Orleans Tribune, yes. And it published over 1,000 issues in 6 years. And it concentrated on matters of central importance to all Blacks: suffrage and equitable labor and the land system to replace slavery.
That's
And
before
they
the
talked about
Chicago
the
Defender.
situation of the freedmen. And
Yeah.
so when you start talking about getting the word out,
Mm-hmm.
you had
Yeah.
this newspaper and other newspapers that were created by free people of color to get the word out, to let people know we're not sitting back here silent. And this is what happened with this newspaper that Mark Charles Roudinet shared. And it's a document of which I would encourage everyone to learn about, because this is not the only newspaper. There's several newspapers that went out on a limb to say, we are here. We're letting you know that we're going to talk about what's happening with enslavement. We're going to pass on word to the communities about what's happening to Black people.
So in other words,
they
they're
were the
raising the
advocates.
flag and saying, listen, this is what's going on.
That's right.
And
yes.
Did they also question regarding newspapers? Because typically we think modern time, they don't just report about just their area.
No, some newspapers would talk about what's happening in the country.
Yes. Okay.
You know, who's making the laws? What happened here? Yes.
At risk, they're telling that.
That's right.
So how did free people of color play? And you've mentioned a little bit about this. Well, how did free people of color play in shaping American society, specifically or particularly in areas like politics? But I want you to talk about land ownership, education, and business. And you mentioned a little bit about them, and for folks to know about you and the Black homesteaders. So that's a role in shaping that a lot of people don't know about. So I'm going to let you have that time for the Homestead Act of 1862 and so forth, because I am so proud to understand and learn about that and then look in my own backyard.
That's right. And I'm glad you did look in your own backyard, because while many people may think of this one narrative of what we sharecropping.
Yes.
We also were created to not just want to be sharecroppers, but to also own land. I mean, you talk about what's the ultimate freedom? Land ownership. I have to own that land. So the Homestead Act of 1862 was passed by Abraham Lincoln. It went into effect in 1863. And individuals had to be over the age of 21. They certainly could never take up arms against the United States. Now, these are some of the guidelines. Never take up arms against the United States.
So would they have to sign off that they wouldn't take up
arms?
Yeah,
there's a whole application that they had to complete. And certainly if they took up arms against the United States, then they, of course, would not be eligible according to the guidelines. Single women, head of households, and the formerly enslaved could also acquire this land. Certainly the 14th Amendment definitely said that they were citizens now. So that opened the door for individuals to obtain this land. And they could get up to 160 acres of land. The big thing, though, is that they had to cultivate that land. They had to live on this land for at least 5 years. Right. They had to complete an application. They had to go in with proof that they did what they said they did as far as cultivation. They had to bring in witnesses to testify on their behalf.
Look at all look at all the points you're hitting. We're looking at names, people that are also in the community, plus what your ancestor could be doing.
Yes, indeed. I mean, just it's probably for many of the descendants of homesteaders, the most exciting document they could ever find. And it went beyond getting a patent. It also including an application process called land entry papers. Excuse me.
So looking at land entry papers and things, one thing I want to make clear, that the 13 colonies did not give out homestead of 1862 property, correct?
That's right. The land that was
Of
available,
Virginia and all those going up, those 13 colonies.
13,
Yeah.
the 13 original colonies and Texas were not a part of the
Okay.
Homestead Act of 1862. However, you have to start looking at what was going on in the states. You have to look, those that were not a part of the Homestead Act of 1862. There was other land though. And I tell people there's other land, there's bounty land.
Sure.
And you start wondering, well, how did my ancestors get bounty land? Those were mostly
Military.
people that were in the military.
Yeah.
And they were given that as part of their payment. And so you have opportunity to search for how did they get that land. And of course, people did buy their land. If they saved their
there's
money,
cash sales.
Yeah, there were cash sales. They did buy that land also, but it does give you an opportunity to start seeking out who were the landowners and the stories behind how they obtained that land.
So I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but I'm going to ask you, give an example, which for me would be Peter Clark. And it started pretty much from oral history. So could you take a moment and share, because this was my introduction to free people of color per se, and owning land, because I believe land was critical for all people of color, but again, because some were enslaved and some are free, that was your status.
That definitely
you
was
own something.
That's right.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about Peter Clark.
Okay, well, let me just tell you, the land story came from my grandmother. She was born in 1894. And she had a picture of her grandfather, which would be my great-great-grandfather. And she told me her granddaddy owned a lot of land. Well, I mean, did she lie to me? I don't know. So part of my research.
She said my granddaddy owned a lot of land.
Yes. Oh, she told me where.
Okay.
She said Marpar, Louisiana.
Okay.
But a lot of land was the thing that got to me.
Yeah.
And so when I noticed in the 1900 census that he was listed as a farmer that owned his land, I saw the 0 on his land. I said, oh, she knew what she was talking about.
Yeah.
And so I went on this journey to find this land. And with the Bureau of Land Management, I then went up to the Bureau of Land Management and looked for a patent. And I found that he did obtain a patent in 1896 for 159.33 acres of land.
Wow.
Now, the thing is,
a black man
who was born in 1855, who became this landowner. Well, the good thing and the beautiful part of this story is one of my cousins had the original land patent. I'm thinking, I'm telling them something. Oh, guess what? Our great-granddaddy owned land. She said, oh, I have the patent. You have the what?
There you go, girl. Give me a copy of that document.
You got to give me a copy of that patent. Yes. But having the patent, you should always ask the question, how? How did he get the land?
How did they acquire it?
And this is where the excitement comes in. Because at the National Archives, I was able to go to the archives and to request a copy of his land entry case file. And if you've ever had a chance to look at a case file, I knew that he was 38 years old when he applied for that land because he put it on his application.
Now you're hitting the timeline. You can clock his.
You could clock it. You got the timeline that he was born in Louisiana. He mentioned where the land was located. He mentioned what he did to the land, how he cultivated the 5 acres, fenced it, had a house, of course, an outhouse. He put the value, which was $105. But you got to think it's back in the day that he was doing this.
Sure.
He also mentioned that in that household was his wife and 4 children, one of which was my grandmother. And also that he listed witnesses.
Mm.
Now, please understand that when you're seeing witnesses, you're seeing the fan club.
Yes, I was going to say, here's the community now.
It's the community.
And you do a talk on the witnesses too.
Oh, yes. I have a talk called Follow the Witnesses.
Yes.
Because I couldn't just look at those names and say, oh, he had, Charlie Baptiste, Henry Tinkshell, Marshall Douglas, Alfred
I want to know
Robinson.
if they're related.
I did. Not only did I want to know if they were related,
Yes.
but in my head, I said, are they Black?
Right.
Were they homesteaders?
So this is for any witness on any document, just not a land pat. Okay.
Yes.
Not on the application.
So anyway, I went through the whole process, getting the land entry case files, following the witnesses, discovering that 3 of the witnesses were also homesteaders, were also Black, found one that was in the United States Colored Troops. Of course, I ordered his pension file.
Sure.
It just opens up a door for you to do the most exciting part of research to allow your ancestors' life to come to life.
Yes.
And to keep saying the names over and over again, which means that he has never died to me. He has always been alive because I continue to tell those stories, and I encourage people to tell those stories.
And it's interesting, of course, we're talking about free people of color. And when I heard you explain this, I was sitting in at a Maggie class at Harris Stowe, HBCU, when Maggie first started off. And you were talking about that, not realizing my summers were spent on homestead property for my family, and got to digging. It was just the property. I wasn't even this is like 2006 or 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't even remember when, but I heard you talking, and of course, Peter Clark. And I thought, oh, and Mama said, there's a picture of the patent, and then I found 4. So again,
Yes.
Looking at free people of color, where your research is at, exclude those 13 colonies. So we're making a point here. Find out if your people had family. Also know that some of those lands could still be in the family and you not know the history back on it. Could it been bounty land or homestead land or whatever it is? And I believe the Homestead Act just ceased in 1977 or something?
Well, it went all the way to Alaska, so it's more than 1977, about 1986 or something.
Oh, okay. Okay. So and that was just federal land, basically, that was given away if you go work it. And I'm going to make one comment, then move on to another question. Part of that application you described, but what I found most intriguing was that they described the house, what was the crops that they built. So in other words, the ancestor was a house with a front door and 2 windows, 5 acres of so-and-so, a barn, And again, now I'm visualizing my ancestors and where they were at when they got this patent. And so thank you for sharing that story on Peter Clark, but the whole homestead property. And of course, we encourage people to go check. And also there is a Facebook page, I believe, that you have.
Yes.
And if you tell the name of that.
Descendants of African American Homesteaders.
Got it.
And it's a big page now. Yeah. And we also have a book out called The Black Homesteaders of the South.
Yes.
It was published by the History Press, and we have 49 stories in there.
49.
49, and it's stories from Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Arkansas.
I love it. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So that next question, you basically already answered. I was going to share that, have you share an example of free person of color whose genealogical research significantly changed or added to the historical understanding. I think land ownership might have hit that one. And again, because there is a myth that Black folks didn't own land. So I think that's a pertinent point to say we probably answered that question. So now looking at expanding the research and awareness for folks, how can genealogists or historians or even educators work together to ensure those stories of free people of color are included in the family and in public history?
Collaboration through digital projects, museum exhibitions, curriculum development. We must put it in the curriculum and tell those stories. Genealogical conferences. This is an opportunity to raise awareness. I mean, I can recall talking to two people, Stephen Hammond, and he spoke of his Syphax family.
Right.
And, you know, it was information that was new to me. But there's Stephen. He's out there. He's talking. The Quander family. You know, you have people that have done the research on their family and they're telling the stories. And I think that one of the things that we have to do is share what we know about free people of color, but also tell those stories. Public history initiatives should actively seek out and integrate free people of color narratives.
So in other words, you don't know what your people were doing. You know what I mean? Until you start investigating, you really don't know what people are doing or what they have done. And it brings it up to where you are today. So again, it's about telling those stories and getting involved. And I like the fact that you talked about collaboration. And number one, start with your genealogy buddy, folks. Get someone you talk to, join the genealogy groups. You know about OGS out there, Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. They have chapters, 37 chapters throughout. I listened to a talk yesterday by Viola Baskerville, and she talked about the 37 chapters. That is the oldest and the only national, I'm going to say, Black Historical Society, and it's Afro because of when it started, and that was in 1977. So again, collaborate, I think, is so key, that we have to share and help each other, you know, and stuff. So another thing, what advice would you give to individuals who are just beginning to explore their free people of color ancestry and here in the United States?
It's the advice that I would give to anybody. Start with your oral histories. Now, some history may have been lost. People don't even realize they have free people of color in their families. But I would definitely say oral history is one of your beginning steps. Not to mention review the census records. Now, what we have happening here is people may start off Black in the census before 1860, but by the time they get to 1880, 1900, the race may have changed. And
or a new term introduced.
Yes. Look at local courthouse documents and understand the historical context. It's important to understand that. That's key of where your ancestors live, what was going on, and understand that those laws that they lived under, they vary by state. So you need to study the law.
Another great point.
Study the laws regarding the rights and the records of free people of color. And with that, I would say, go for it. But you need to even think out of the box. Say, some people say, well, we don't have free people of color in our family. Think out of the box. Start looking.
Because just because you find them free at one time doesn't mean that they could have been enslaved prior to, or vice versa.
Correct.
They could have been born free and then enslaved, or born enslaved and became free.
Right.
And then there was that time that, and I can't quote the date, and but there was that time that those slave owners had the opportunity to go north and go get their folks that they previously had enslaved and bring them back to the South.
Right.
So it just wasn't. And again, I think back to the experience and the emotional part. Didn't matter if you were free or enslaved, you weren't safe throughout this whole time. And that's the way I take it personally. You're just not safe. Yeah. So I'm going to give one more question, and then we'll to you, and then we're going to go to a couple questions from the chat. So looking ahead, what steps should be taken to further integrate free people of color into the mainstream genealogical research and historical discussions? And you gave a hint that, already mentioned about conferences and things. But how do we do this? How do we keep it coming or getting that? I'm going to almost say that we're now building the talk. Hey, there's free people of color, or in my family. I need to talk about it. What would you say? What are some steps that we can take?
I'd like to go back to talking about the need for advocacy for better digitization of records.
Yes.
And let those records speak to the masses so that we know how to access those records. Let those stories come out. Also, inclusion in the major genealogy platforms like Ancestry, Family Search, MyHeritage. All of these platforms could also talk about free people of color.
Yeah.
Make certain that we know these are free people of color. Increase academic research on free people of color. I enjoy reading the books that have been written for individuals that are working on their dissertations. And these books get published. I was looking at Warren Miltier Jr.'s book.
Yeah.
North Carolina's Free People of Color from, I think it's 1715 to 1885. Some individuals will start off, that's part of their dissertation, that they're studying free people of color. So let's encourage that. They need funds even to help them with their academic research. And I just want to encourage more diverse storytelling in genealogy media is also crucial. And we could do that.
We could do that. But also, I think about, you got to start with yourself and start with your story. And it could be the path of where you're going or what you've been told in oral history. A lot of times we're going after the ancestors. And you mentioned about talking to family members, the elders, and this, that, and other. But I think about this, I got to tell that story. But it's going to be from me and my perspective. Because you know what? My cousin might have got a different perspective, even though it could have came from the same great grandmother, but how they understood it could have been different. And a short story that there was always about a homesteader, matter of fact, my family, that they donated 5 acres of land for the township cemetery. And this is from their homestead land. Well, here I come. I find a document where they sold it for $35. And it was almost like, oh my God, I got my mama and all her siblings that I need to say they didn't donate that land. But what happened was the oral history, the son of that couple donated land for the community right across the street or the road. And so that oral history got turned a little bit. He donated land, and actually for a church, and they sold 5 acres to the township for the cemetery.
Right.
And so again, listening, I think it's just awesome, you know, that we can bring those stories, but start with what you know. And I think that's my takeaway for folks, and then all the stuff that you've shared. So I'm going to check in Brian Sheffy, who's our director of the Center for Family History at the museum in Charleston, is there in the conference room. And so we got a couple of questions from there. So one of them is that, is it worth trying to find court cases that involve free people of color? Do lawsuits have any useful information?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, it's on the screen for you. It's on
Yes,
the screen.
absolutely. Lawsuits. In fact, the lawsuits give you even more details,
Yes.
and it shows you other people that are speaking on behalf of. You know, you have to, with a lawsuit, you come in with evidence.
Yes.
And so lawsuits have a lot to do with you finding information about what happened with free people of color. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've got a piece of paper that says, get Caroline and the children out of Virginia and take them to Middleburg, Pennsylvania. That was in the lawsuit.
Mhm.
He freed them and then said, get them out of Virginia.
Yes.
And again, that was in a lawsuit. I wasn't looking for that or expected that,
Yes.
you know, but yes, the fines there are unbelievable. So the next question says, did free people of color pay taxes? Where are those records held?
Free people of color had to do the exact same thing that the others that were doing. When they own property or they had to pay taxes.
So it didn't matter what color.
Didn't matter. They had to pay.
Just like the white people.
Just like the white people, yes. So you're going to look at the tax rolls, and which means you're going to go to the courthouse.
Could be personal property tax records as well.
Yeah. They're paying on that horse.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
they're paying on the little acres of land that they have, but
yes.
they are paying taxes. Yes.
Yes. So let me check. I think there's a couple other ones here. And there's some comments in here also. And there's one, it's Lanoke County Research. She's commenting about the lawsuits, a major reason why free people of color records are available. She said, I truly believe there are more out there. Absolutely. And thank you for making that comment.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yes. And Renata Yarborough Sanders commented also about taxes. They also paid capitation taxes and fees in some locations. So the records are there. So folks, don't let people say you can't find information about people prior to, and I'm saying 1870, but it's also after 1870, but we know they're in the records after 1870 because the 1870 census, federal census, was the first record set where free people were already noted in the census, but people that were previously enslaved were also listed in the federal census. Viola Baskerville says, a hint, look at the end of the tax rolls. Often they are listed together as free people of color. So excellent, excellent, excellent. So one of the things as we're winding down here, and I know we had a small conversation before we came on live, but what would you, if you had one thing to tell people about researching their free people of color, what would be the one takeaway that you would tell them about what we talked about today?
The one takeaway is don't walk away thinking that you do not have free people of color in your family. Look.
Yes.
Look. That's my takeaway. If you don't look, you won't find.
Yeah. Yeah. We need that in a t-shirt. Just look. Instead of just do it like Nike. Just look.
Just look. Just look. And also, I didn't say anything about this, but consider the fact that your folks also had religious experiences and they followed religious leaders. So look at those folks that were in the African Methodist Episcopal Church or the follow Richard Allen. You know, you got to look at some of those religious leaders and follow them and see what was happening with your families during that particular period of time.
So you made another statement to me, and folks that know me hear me say this all the time. And that was about researching white people to find your people. So you researching, looking for your ancestors, whatever state, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter if I'm talking about the North or the South, because we know slavery was up there, free people of color were up there, no different than down in the South. But why is it critical for us researching our people of color that we also got to look at the white people?
The white people had control.
Mm-hmm.
The white people had records.
Mm-hmm.
The white people documented what they had. And so I say you have to look at the white folks in your community. Mm-hmm. And they may have the clue that will help
made
you.
The laws and made the records.
They have the clues that will take you to the next level.
Yeah.
So really, you want to know, everything is context. Mm-hmm. Put your ancestors in the context of what was going on in that community. Excellent. Who was in power and how things were documented. Mm-hmm. And with that, it will include the white people in the communities.
So there's a comment that it's a great point when you mention about the churches and so forth. Many of the and this is, I believe this is Brian Sheffy. He said, this is a great point. Many of my Appalachian free people of color family were married by circuit preachers in the 18th and the 19th century. So again, we named churches, we named courthouses, right? We named cemeteries. And so now you've got to find what's going on in that community. So another excellent point on that. And another thing, and I think you alluded to it, about us telling the story. How do we start? How do we just start telling that story? If I told you I wanted to write, and I'm going to say my ancestors, Peter Clark, how do I just start? And what record should I go to first?
You know, I start with my beginning. Where did that name come from? How did I even hear his name?
Okay.
Which meant it started with oral history, because I would not have known that name at all if I had not been told that name. But then I started in the courthouse basically looking for Peter Clark, because I started trying to verify who he married, because my grandmother told me that his wife was named Rebecca Youngblood. I found his marriage record in the courthouse when he got married in 1874.
So did they pay taxes on their homestead property?
Later on, yes, because unfortunately he lost his land.
Okay.
Because of failure to pay taxes. Yes.
So was those records in the courthouse on them?
Yes, ma'am. I found every last one.
So I'm answering a question that was in the chat.
Yes, ma'am. I found the tax record. I found all the court papers associated with that land and all the legal,
they were there.
The legal stuff that the family went through. Yes.
Okay. Great. Great. Any parting words?
As we started off, and as this series has been evolving over the weeks, I think that you have made it very clear, and those that have spoken before this wrap up, that it is important for you to look at free people of color. Make that part of your research. Don't ignore it. Don't follow the myth that everyone was enslaved, and think out of the box and do your research.
Great words. We thank you, Bernice Alexander Bennett. And thank you to those of you that joined us today for the podcast at the International African American Museum Center for Family History. We thank you again as our guests for sharing your invaluable information, knowledge, and perspectives and dedication to preserving of the history. And the thing of it is, we want to make sure folks are walking away with something. And we shared a lot of information here today. To the viewers and the listeners, whether you joined us through StreamYard or through YouTube or you're in person at the museum, we appreciate your time and your engagement. Your participation is what makes this podcast meaningful for us as well as yourself. So I want to give out a quick reminder. Our next podcast is going to be March 15th. We are going to have the South Carolina Low Country Digital Library on and the South Carolina Historical Society on, and finding out what they have, what they've done. And I was just told that they completed some slave era project with names and things. So tune in for that same time, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And again, thank you to Bernice. And next time, folks, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep connecting with your history. From all of us at the International African American Museum and the Center for Family History, take care and have a wonderful day. Appreciate it. Hold on a minute, Bernice. Whitney will shut off the live stream.